I don't know about you, but one of the biggest motivations for me to upgrade my cell phone as often as I do is that the cameras just keep getting better. Now, we're not seeing as big of leaps as we used to in the time of iPhone 4, iPhone 5S, but this year I think we saw a really interesting improvement in the Google Pixel 2. They really pushed things forward, and even though they're using similar lens and sensor to everyone else, their image signal processing is doing such a good job that I think this camera deserves a little extra attention. So what I'm gonna do is I invited my friend Jason Ang over, who's an incredibly talented professional photographer that shoots on a Hasselblad, which is a large, beautiful, expensive medium format camera. And we're gonna compare the two and see what you're getting when you really spend the extra money for a big pro camera. So how does a 2017 flagship cell phone camera that costs around $1,000 compare to a professional medium format system, which costs closer to $20,000? All right, so Jason came over and he brought his H4D. Jason, I don't know a lot about Hasselblads. I don't shoot them, so let's sit down and you can explain how this camera works to me. So I've used the X1D a bit. I did a review about it, but that was kind of the most I'd shot with the medium format. I don't use them often. So why do professionals still reach for these big sensor cameras?
Well, traditionally in the past, a camera with a larger sensor has cleaner information, and the sensor in this is generally about 30% as a rule of thumb larger than a 35 millimeter. The larger sensor also gives you more covering power, say with a portrait lens 80 millimeter, and mixed with a leaf shutter, you can shoot at any sync speed your flash can handle.
Right, so it's a mix of that. There's more raw horsepower in this thing in a way, like the hardware is more powerful. And then it also just brings some professional features that you need. So this isn't gonna bring any of those pro features like faster, like syncing with a flash at all.
Right.
But what I think it can do well is things like dynamic range and sharpness and a few others that I wanna test side by side, because okay, I know this isn't gonna beat that, but I think there are some places that we're gonna be surprised how much better this performs than it deserves to.
Right.
Part of the way I've been thinking about this is that this is doing it all in hardware, whereas this is doing a lot of that work in software. And I think we're gonna see really big differences when we zoom into 100% versus look at a thumbnail. Like when we look at Instagram size, can you really tell the difference?
Right.
So, all right, let's try some things.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we need to test these in a way that we get some kind of blown out highlights and some dark shadows. So let's set up our light. And to light this, we're using the new Aputure 300D, which is a very powerful LED light that I'm excited about. I'm kind of considering buying it. The Camera Store TV lent it to me today, and so I'm excited to test it out. We set up our light to have a really high ratio between the brightest and darkest points, so this should stretch the dynamic range of both cameras quite a bit. Anya has come to volunteer her modeling services.
For free.
For free?
I'm here for free.
But so what we've done here is we set up our light in a place that's like a really high contrast situation, where this side is a lot brighter than this side. And then we're gonna see which photo holds more detail in those highlights and shadows. Any camera with a large sensor is gonna have a huge advantage here. Traditionally, small sensor cameras really struggle with dynamic range, but the Google has some tricks up its sleeve using HDR Plus to combine up to 10 images into one final exposure. So looking at these results, I do think the Pixel is holding up really well. Like all the photos are very usable, especially at this thumbnail size. So this is kind of a well exposed one. We can compare it to the Hasselblad. Where the Pixel isn't doing as well, which isn't terribly surprising, is that the shadows lose quite a bit more detail. The other biggest thing is if we look at where the highlights start to blow out and get overexposed on the Hasselblad, it's a really smooth transition. Like her skin still looks great, even though there's too much exposure on it. And the HDR is able to save it a bit. Like here's full overexposure. You can see it just clips. Here's the HDR kicking in, bringing the skin back, but it adds a bit of extra texture to the skin that isn't really desirable. So in the end, the Hasselblad is doing much better. Any DSLR is going to do better, but at this kind of thumbnail size, at what I'd say is an Instagram size, I mean, I think the Pixel's doing fine. Okay, and next, let's do some tests to see how the sharpness of these cameras stack up. Jason, how many megapixels is in the Hasselblad?
40.
Okay, so I think at 100% we know who's gonna win, like when we zoom all the way in, but
in real world comparisons, your 6x9 laptop screen or Instagram will see who holds up.
this one's interesting because although the large sensor does make for a way higher resolution image, so especially if you're looking at it printed at a large format or on a big screen, but the perceived sharpness on a smaller screen will probably be pretty similar. And in these results, when I'm zoomed out, I think they look pretty similar. Now, if we zoom in, you really can see a pretty huge difference. You start to see a bit of what I'd call that watercolor effect in her face, where you can see the camera starting to like remove noise because this wasn't a really bright lighting situation. So it had to clean up the photo a bit. Whereas in the Hasselblad photo, it's just perfectly clean all the way through. But at the same time, I think there was quite a few photos on this that missed focus. There were actually a few more photos on the Hasselblad that were completely out of focus than on the Pixel. And these two photos I'm looking at have been downsized to be the same resolution. The lenses don't quite match, so that's why you're seeing it zoom in. Now, if we look at the Hasselblad at 100%, yeah, okay, this is this is obviously sharper. This is what the extra resolution does for you. But you're only going to see that if you blow up the photo. In a smaller size, you won't notice the difference. Oh, and did I mention I'm giving away a Pixel 2? All you have to do is follow me on Instagram and comment to my most recent photo and say hashtag amazing or a camera emoji. Just something so I know that you're interested in the giveaway. And do all that before February 1st, 2018. Now we're gonna test the depth of field. We've added some Christmas lights into the back. There are gonna be some nice little points of light. The plants will blur out too. The way Google's algorithm works for this is really interesting. It basically takes the dual pixels, which is each pixel split in two, and there's like a micron of distance between them, and it uses that difference of perspective to calculate what's in the foreground and what's in the background. Whatever it sees as the background or foreground pixels, it turns them into little disks, and those all stacked on each other is what gives that perception of like a lens blur and not just a Gaussian blur. Since mobile phones have added portrait modes with intelligent background blur, average people that would never buy a big camera have had access to this look. And based on my Instagram feed, it's a huge hit. To be honest, I always think that I can see past this digital blur and that, you know, since I'm a photographer and have been for a while, I can always spot it. But you know what, when I see things fly by in my Instagram feed, a lot of the time portrait mode fools me. And looking at these two, if I squint my eyes, I might forget which is which, especially if we're looking at the plant here. The plant blur is very similar. It doesn't really give it away. What does give it away is the lights. There's a really crisp outline, a very specific look to the Christmas lights in the true lens and sensor blur coming from the Hasselblad, whereas we switch over to the Google, it is much more digital. That is the giveaway point. The Google did a pretty great job of cutting her out. You can see a few artifacts here, but it does the best job of any of the current smartphones. I think it does a better job than the iPhone X. But there were a few example photos where it didn't work as well, and I did select the best of the photos. So you are going to have to take a few more photos to make sure that portrait mode works for you. And of course, if we look at the Hasselblad, it's cut out perfectly because it's optics. One feature that the Hasselblad can't offer is selfie portraits, and I've been really surprised how great these work on the Google Pixel 2. Anya, thank you for the help. Everybody go see Anya's blog, Anya B. And remember, anytime you see somebody telling you that a smartphone is going to be replacing your DSLR, it's probably just clickbait. Just like doing a comparison between a $20,000 camera and a smartphone.